Yesterday's class we have discussed about select filters. Okay. In the current session we'll be going to discuss about Servlet listeners. Okay. HTTP Servlet listeners. HTTP Servlet listeners. The concept of listeners is there in all software technologies. In Java or .NET or PHP or whatever it might be, there is a concept of listeners. What the fun of listeners means? When an event is occurred or when an event is triggered, okay, automatically this listener will be executed. Let's consider that we have a swipe card. Okay, when we swipe the swipe card on the swipe machine, automatically the corresponding process will happen. Okay, and door will be open. So putting a swipe card at the swipe machine is a event. When that event happens, some listener will be executed, which will evaluate the card and which will send a signal that yes, it is correct. Okay, and door will be open. Okay, that kind of event listener mechanism will be there in any software technology. In Servlets, yes, listeners are there for many events. What are the possible events in Servlets that can have a listener? What are the possible events in Servlets that can have a listener? Okay. Basically, these listeners are of two types. In Servlets, listeners are of two types. There are listeners or events. They are classified into two types. Lifecycle events, attribute events. Okay, basically the events in Servlets are of two types: lifecycle events and attribute events. Okay, lifecycle events means, okay, the events occur, okay, at different stages of life cycle of any entity are called as lifecycle events. The events that occur at different stages of life cycle of any entity. The events that occur at different stages of life cycle of any entity are called as life cycle events. Okay. For example, session will be created at some point of time, and it will be invalidated at some point of time. Okay. So select context will be created when the server is started, destroyed when the server is stopped. So request has request event, it has a life cycle. So the events that happen at different stages of life cycle of any object or of any entity are called as life cycle events. Okay. In most of the cases, life cycle events will be tracked for servlet context and HTTP session. In most of the cases, life cycle events will be tracked for servlet context and HTTP session. Okay, context means whether the context is initialized or context is destroyed. Okay, session means session is activated or session is destroyed, like that. Like that, we have multiple events in life cycle of servlet context and session. We'll discuss them. Okay, and attribute events. Okay, we can add attributes to any object like HTTP session, servlet context, HTTP request. Like this, for any object we can add attributes. Okay. What are the three events that can happen for attribute? For attribute, what are the three events that can happen? We can add an attribute, we can update an attribute, or we can remove an attribute. Okay, these are the three possible events that can happen for attributes. Okay, we can add an attribute to any object, session or request or context. We can remove an attribute from the object, or we can update the existing attribute. So these attribute events mainly concentrate on these three phases or stages: adding attribute, updating an attribute, and removing an attribute. Okay. Now, let us see different listeners for different events. Okay. Let me develop a listener class, and for each and every specific listener scenario there is a listener interface. Okay, let's consider like HTTP session attribute. Okay, there is a listener HTTP session attribute listener. Okay, so for each and every listener scenario there is a listener. We'll see that. First one is lifecycle events. Let us see the first object lifecycle event. Servlet context lifecycle event. Okay. So The listener interface that represents the Servlet context lifecycle event is let me develop a new listener class, a normal class. My Servlet context listener. Okay. The class will implement to Servlet context listener. Servlet context listener is there in javax.servlet package. So it is important. Okay. The listener that represents to the life cycle of Servlet context is Servlet context listener. Okay. The listener that represents the life cycle of Servlet context is Servlet context listener. Okay. Now this Servlet context listener interface has two unimplemented methods: context initialized and context destroyed. Context initialized and context destroyed. Okay. There are two methods in this abstract. There are two abstract methods in this interface. Servlet context listener. We should implement them. Those two methods are context initialized and context destroyed. The name itself will specify this method will be executed whenever the servlet context is initialized. This method will be executed whenever the servlet context is destroyed. Those are the two phases in Servlet context lifecycle. The server startup, context will be initialized. The server shutdown, context will be destroyed. Okay? If you want to execute some mandatory business logic when the servlet context is initialized, we will write that in this method. If you want to write some kind of logic whenever the servlet context is shut down or whenever the server is shut down, then we will write this logic in this place. Understood? So this is what the listener is. Whenever an event is fired, automatically the corresponding listener method is executed. Just let me write some system.out.println. Okay, please don't write now. Just let me complete this. Okay. Now let me execute one of the applications. Let me execute this. Okay. Application is started. Let me see in the console. Where is the console? sorry. See, once the listener, let me stop the server. It's a mistake from my side. Once we develop a listener, how the server will know that there is a listener? We should configure that listener in web.xml. So, let me configure the listener in web.xml. Develop a listener, configure the listener in web.xml. So, inside web.xml, in general, listeners will be on the top. Listeners should be on the top of web.xml. Listeners should be on the top. Understood? Okay? It's just there will be a listener tag. The child tag as listener class where we configure the listener. That's it. We need not to map the listener class to any servlet class. Listener classes, the registered listener classes will be automatically triggered when a specific event happens. When a specific event happens, listener classes will be automatically triggered. We need not to map the listener classes with any of the servers. And preferably, listener classes should be on the top of web.xml. Understood? So, develop a listener, configure that listener in the listener tag in web.xml, just which has a syntax like this. There will be a listener tag. In the listener tag, there will be a child tag with the name listener class. In the listener class, in the body of the listener class, we configure the listener class along with the package structure. Okay? Understood? So, now let me stop the server. Let me run the application on server. The application is executed. Okay? In the console. Why? Class not one exception. Okay, sorry. Let me execute this. Let me stop the server. And let me clear the console. Want to clear the console, just click on this. Okay, and let me restart the application. So the application is started, and let me see in the console. I'm not sure why context slice is not executed. Not sure. Let me write another entity. We configure this in web.xml. Where is it? Where is this? Where did I configure the listener? Earlier in web.xml, right? But where it is? Let me configure. Oh, yeah, that's a problem. I have configured in the web.xml of another web application, right? That I have deleted. That might be the problem. Let me configure a listener. Listener class, which is first. Let me configure the first listener class. Okay, and let me execute this application. Class for restart. Okay, it is starting the server, and the server is started. Let's see the console. So, first of all, the context initialized method is called while starting the server. Okay, just because the context will be initialized when the server is started. While starting the server, if you want to write any business logic for that web application, then we write that logic in the context initialized method. While stopping the server, if you want to write any business logic, while stopping the server, if you want to write any business logic, otherwise, let me not stop the server from here. Let me start the server. The server is started. While starting the server, context initialized method is executed. Okay, and let me go to the servers and let me try to stop the server. Okay, when I try to stop the server, context destroy method is executed. Okay, so context initialized will be executed at the first when starting the server. Context destroy method will be executed at the last when stopping the server. Understood? Context will be first initialized and last destroy. Understood? So when I stop the server, context destroy method is executed. Now let me start the server. Let me clear the console. I have cleared the console and let me start the server. Okay. If I try to start the server and see the console, context initialized method is being executed at the beginning. Okay. If I try to start the server, let me go here and stop the server. So context destroy method is being executed at the end. Understood? Okay. This is how a listener will work. Just develop a listener class which implements the corresponding listener interface. Implement the corresponding methods. If you want to track the events of a Servlet context lifecycle, just use Servlet context listener interface and implement the methods context initialized and context destroy. The context initialized method will be automatically triggered. Okay, whenever the Servlet context is initialized. Servlet context destroy method will be automatically triggered whenever the Servlet context is destroyed. Okay, and once we develop a listener class, that listener class should be registered in web.xml using the tag listener. Okay, and using listener class tag. Okay, in the listener class tag, in the body of listener class, just we configure the listener class. That's it. And preferably listener classes should be registered at the top of web.xml. Okay. Understood the flow of listeners? Develop a listener class which suits your purpose. Now the current purpose is to track Servlet context lifecycle event. So I have used Servlet context listener, and I have overridden two methods: context initialize, context destroy. Okay, and I have configured that listener in the listener tag. Understood? This is how listeners will work. Just if you want, you can write this class. You can note down this class if you want. And this context initialize method will take an argument which is Servlet context event. In this Servlet context event, we can get the Servlet context object. Okay, we can get the Servlet context object. Once we have Servlet context object, we can do anything. Okay, we can access the properties, or we can modify the properties, or we can do anything. Okay, the Servlet context event object, okay, has a reference to Servlet context. Understood? See, context initialize, both context initialize as well as context destroy will take an argument which is a Servlet context event. The Servlet context event has a method to get the Servlet context object. Okay, once we have Servlet context object, we can do anything like get init parameter or anything we can do. Okay, understood? So like that we can make use of the Servlet context object. Understood? Now
this one is used for tracking the events.
yes, just it will be used for tracking. You can tell it as tracking. See, if you want to open a resource, if you want to open a database connection or a file system, whenever the context is initialized, then we write that logic in this context initialized method. If you want to close some resources, whenever the context is destroyed, we go for this context destroy method. Okay, like that, at a particular point of time, when a particular event happens, if you want to trigger some methods, or if you want to trigger some business logic, we write that business logic in this business. Just write this class, note down this class. Understood? Okay, over. So this both context initialized and context destroy methods of Servlet context listener will take a object which is Servlet context event that represents the event. Okay, okay, and the context event has the reference of Servlet context object. Okay, the Servlet context event has the reference of Servlet context object. Once we have Servlet context object, we can do anything with the Servlet context. We can add attribute, okay, or we can do some action on Servlet context object. Understood? So now once we develop a listener by implementing with the corresponding interface, just we take this listener class and configure that in web.xml, the listener tag. Just write down this. Have you noted it down? Everybody? So just go for a listener tag in the top of web.xml, okay, inside web app tag, and go for a listener class tag where in the body of listener class we configure the listener. That's it. Okay, and we need not to map listener with any servlet or any entity. Listeners will be automatically triggered by the web server when a specific event is fired. When a specific event is fired, automatically corresponding listeners will be executed. Okay. Now, the next type of listener is session listeners. Okay, session lifecycle listener. The session lifecycle listener is HTTP session listener. Okay, HTTP session listener is a session lifecycle listener. Context lifecycle listener is Servlet context listener. Servlet context listener is the context lifecycle listener. Okay, Servlet context lifecycle listener. Okay, HTTP session listener. This is the lifecycle listener for HTTP session. Okay, and it will take HTTP session event. It will be almost same like context. Okay, there context initialize, context restore. Here session creator, session restore, and there it will take select context event. Here it will take HTTP session event. No, sir? Okay, so let me configure this listener in web.xml. I have developed a listener. Okay, let me configure this listener in web.xml. Just in the same way. In the same way, we can configure any listener. Just use a listener tag. In listener class, configure the listener class. That's it. And from login servlet, the control will go to login servlet. Let me go to the login servlet. Let me try to create a session. Just let me keep some system order. Just before creating session and after creating the session. Okay, understood? Now let me execute this application. It will ask for a restart. The server is shut up, and let me submit this page. So there is the control is in login servlet. And let me see the console. Before creating session created, and after creating session. So now in these two statements, in between these two statements, before creating session and after creating session, what are the statements exist? What are the statements exist in this between these statements? Only creation of session object. So whenever the session object is created, automatically the corresponding session listener is triggered. Which method of session listener is triggered means, okay, session created method will be triggered. Understood? Like that it will be. Okay. Let me try to invalidate the session. Okay. Before invalidating session, after invalidating session. So in between these two statements, let me invalidate the session. Whenever we invalidate the session, at that point of time itself, the session will be destroyed. Know that session will be destroyed whenever invalidate method is executed. All of you know that, right? Session will be invalidated or session will be destroyed whenever we execute invalidate method. Okay? Now let me execute this. Restart the server. Server is started, and let me execute this application. So control will go to login servlet. So before creating the session and after creating the session, in between these two statements, okay, before creating session and after creating session, in these two statements we created a session. So in between these two statements, session created method is being executed. Understood? In between, before creating session and after creating session, we have created a session object. Okay, so session created method is executed, and in between, before invalidating session and after invalidating session, we have executed invalidate method of the session. So session destroy method is executed. Understood? This is how we can track the life cycle event of HTTP session. Okay. Okay. Understood? Now there is another session related listener, okay, which we call as a session activation listener. Session activation listener. Okay, so let me implement HTTP session activation listener. Okay, this has two methods: session deactivate, session will password. Okay, that is initialization and restriction. This is activation and passivation. Activation means whenever the session is active. Passivation is whenever the session is inactive.
So after initiation, it won't be activated.
It will be activated. Okay. In some of the cases, we can inactivate the session. Like we'll time out the session. Whenever we time out the session, it will not be inactive by default. So it will be inactive. That's it. It will not be destroyed. Whenever we time out the session, at the timeout session will be destroyed not at that point of time. It will take a bit time to destroy the session. But when exactly the timeout occurs, passivate method will be executed. Understood? For that kind of activation and passivation. Activation means session will be active. Passivation means session will be inactive but not destroyed. Session passivation is different, session destruction is different. Okay? But both will take the same method, HTTP session event. But if we call invalidate, at the same time, session will be passivated as well as destroyed. But in case of timeout, session passivation and destruction will happen at different points. Okay? So, to track activation of or inactivation of a session, we go for session activation listener, which has two methods: session deactivates and session will passivate. Okay. Now let me configure this in web.xml. Okay. Let me restart the server. The server is started. If I submit, go to login servlet. But where is this? Is there anything here? System deactivate. Now what we'll do is, let me add some attributes. I'm not sure why it is not being called. Okay, I'll let you know later on how this activation listener will work. But this activation listener will be used to track active or inactive sessions. Okay. And the next type of listeners are attribute listeners. Okay. Attribute listeners, we can add attributes to any entity. Like we can add attributes to select context, session, select request. Okay. Like this, for any of the entities, we can add attributes. Okay. For all the attribute related entities, there are specific listeners. Okay. What are the three possible events of attributes? Attribute is added, updated, removed. Okay. Update or replace is one and the same. Okay. Update or replace the existing value with another value is one and the same. Okay. So let me develop an attribute listener which is my select context attribute listener. Okay. Which even for a select context also there is interface implements select context attribute listener. Select context attribute listener, which has three methods: attribute added, attribute replaced, attribute removed. Okay. This has three methods: attribute added, replaced, and removed. Just let me make it attribute event. So select context attribute listener will take select context attribute event. Okay. There are three methods: attribute added, replace, and remove. Whenever we add the attribute to select context object, this method will be executed. Attribute added method will be executed. The same way, attribute replaced. The same way, attribute removed. Add, replace, and remove. Okay. Just whenever an attribute is added to select context object, then attribute added will be executed. Whenever attribute value is replaced, then attribute replace will be executed. Whenever attribute is removed, then attribute removed will be executed. Understood? attribute replace and attribute remove. Okay, so now let me configure this in web.xml. Okay, and then in the servlet, what I'll do is in order to get the select context object, yes, we will go for get just because the servlet implements with select config also. So in select config directly there is get select context. Okay, just get select context dot set attribute, and just before adding attribute. Okay, and after adding attribute. Okay, and since the attribute is already added, before replacing attribute. Okay, and then after replacing attribute. Okay, and then before removing attribute. After removing attribute, in between I'll remove an attribute. And execute the remove attribute. Attribute name is test. Understood what I have done? Just I have added, updated or replaced and removed the attribute, and I'm trying to track those events. Okay, now let me try to execute the application. Restart the server. Submit the application. See, before adding attribute and after adding attribute, in between select context attribute added is being executed. Okay, before replacing attribute and after replacing attribute, and in between attribute replace is executed. Understood? So before removing attribute and after removing attribute, in between attribute removed is executed. Okay, in between those statements, did I execute any other statement other than remove attribute? No. Whenever remove attribute of servlet context is executed, the corresponding listeners, okay, attribute remove method is executed. Understood? That's how the listeners of attributes will work. Okay. The same methods are there for HTTP session as well as HTTP select request. Okay. We have now in this event, in this attribute event, okay, just we can track what is the attribute. Okay, what is the attribute that is what we call modified or added or removed. Just in that method, in the attribute added, we can get what is the name of the attribute that is being added. Understood? Just go for attribute event dot get name. We'll give you the name of the attribute that is being added when this event is triggered. Okay? In the same way, here also, what is the attribute that is replaced? Here also, what is the attribute that is removed? Okay? Just go for the event dot get name. It will get the name of the attribute that is being added or updated or removed. Understood? Okay. In the same way, we can add another class which is my session attribute listener. Let me remove this. So, which implements with HttpSession attribute listener. Okay, HttpSession attribute listener. Okay, the same methods are there: attribute added, attribute removed, attribute replaced. But the argument type is different. It is HttpSession binding event. The argument is different. HttpSession binding event. Okay. There, in case of select context, okay, it is select context attribute event. Now it is HttpSession binding event. Okay. But the methods are same: attribute added, removed, and replaced. Whenever we add an attribute to HttpSession object, attribute added will be executed. Whenever we remove, attribute removed. Whenever we update, attribute replaced. In the same way, we will have HTTP request attribute listener. Okay, so whenever we add or update or remove an attribute from HTTP request object, the corresponding method will be executed. Okay, wherever there is a possibility to add attribute, attribute listeners are there. For HTTP session, we can add or replace or remove attribute. Select context, we can do the same. Select request, we can do the same. So, for all those objects, there are corresponding listeners. Okay. Mainly, lifecycle listeners and these attribute listeners are used. Okay. Just you need to know how to develop a listener and how to configure a listener in the web XML. That's it. Argument? Argument in the sense? Yeah, HTTP select request event will be there in the same way. massive power cut. Let me pause the video until the power comes. Okay, in the same way, okay, we have okay, we have HTTP do not remember the exact last name of the request attribute listener. Servlet request attribute listener. Okay, Servlet request attribute listener. The same way. Add it, remove, request. Okay, the same way we have select request attribute event. Okay, the listener is select request attribute listener and the event is select request attribute event. Just what you do is in one paper list out all the listeners and all the events. Just list out them now. List out all the listeners that we have used till now. Just make two sections. The first section is lifecycle listeners. The second section is attribute listeners. Okay? And lifecycle listeners, what are the different listeners we have? Attribute listeners, what are the listeners that we have? And we have another lifecycle listener, which is Servlet request lifecycle listener. Servlet request lifecycle listener. In the same way, request initialize, request destroy. Okay. There are three types of lifecycle listener. One for select context, select request, and session. Okay. Select request listener is select request listener, and the event is select request event. And it has just write down the listener, what are the methods present in listener, and what is the event. Listener, methods present in the listener, and the event for all the listeners. First one is select request listener. Just see here, you need not turn the notes. The first one is select request listener. Okay? Select request listener is listener which is used to represent the life cycle of a request. Okay? So the methods are request initialize and request destroy. Write down there. Select request listener is the first life cycle listener which has two methods: request initialize, request destroy. Select request listener has two methods: request initialized, request destroyed. Request initialized and request